In 1581, a German miller named Peter Stumpp faced an execution so horrific that even the hardened crowd of spectators turned away. His bones would be systematically shattered, one by one, while he remained fully conscious. The executioner's tool? A massive wooden wheel that would give this torture its name. But here's what made it truly terrifying. Death wouldn't come for hours, sometimes days. The victim would be left alive, their broken body woven through the spokes like a grotesque tapestry, displayed high above the crowd. They called it the breaking wheel, and what happened during those final hours was worse than anything you can imagine. If you're fascinated by the dark corners of history that most documentaries won't touch, you're in the right place. Subscribe and ring the bell. We uncover forgotten horrors every single week. Medieval Europe didn't just punish criminals. It made a spectacle of their suffering. In an age before prisons as we know them, justice was swift, brutal, and above all, public. The town square became a theater of horror where hanging was considered merciful, where burning at the stake drew crowds like festivals, and where the screams of the condemned served as both entertainment and warning. But even in this landscape of institutionalized cruelty, one method stood apart. While beheading offered the promise of a quick death and hanging usually ended within minutes, there existed a form of execution so methodically cruel that it challenged the very limits of human endurance. It wasn't just about ending a life, it was about extending death itself into an agonizing performance that could last for days. The medieval mind understood punishment differently than we do today. In their world, the body was a canvas for justice, and pain was the ink that wrote cautionary tales for all to see. Public executions weren't hidden away in prison yards. They were civic events, complete with vendors selling food and parents bringing children to witness what happened to those who broke the law. But among all these horrors, one method achieved something uniquely terrifying. It turned the human body into a living monument to suffering, transforming execution from an event into a prolonged state of being. The breaking wheel, known in German as the Rad and in French as the Rouet, was deceptively simple in its construction. Picture a large wooden wagon wheel, perhaps 6 feet in diameter, reinforced with iron bands. Now imagine that wheel not as a tool of transportation, but as an instrument designed to methodically destroy the human body while keeping the victim alive for as long as possible. The process began with the condemned being stretched out on the ground or a low platform, their limbs extended and tied to stakes. The executioner would then raise the heavy wheel above his head and bring it crashing down onto the victim's limbs, starting with the ankles and wrists, working methodically inward toward the torso. Each blow was calculated to shatter bones without causing immediate death. The 16th century German chronicler Hans Jacob Christoffel von Grimmelshausen described it as the breaking of the body in such a manner that the marrow flows from the bones, yet life remains. But the wheel itself was only the beginning. What truly set this execution apart wasn't just the breaking, it was what came after. The shattered body would be threaded through the spokes of the wheel, arms and legs woven between the wooden beams like rope, creating a grotesque human sculpture. The wheel would then be hoisted onto a tall pole, displaying the still living victim high above the crowd. And there, under the sun and stars, exposed to the elements and the birds, the broken soul would begin their true ordeal, waiting for death while their body remained a twisted testament to medieval justice. The breaking wheel emerged from the fog of the early Middle Ages, with the first documented uses appearing in 6th century Gregory of Tours' writings about Frankish kingdoms. But it wasn't until the High Middle Ages that this method evolved into the elaborate ritual of suffering that would terrorize Europe for nearly 1,000 years. The logic behind the wheel was rooted in medieval theology and social order. Unlike hanging, which was often reserved for common thieves, or beheading, which maintained a certain dignity for the nobility, the wheel was designed for those whose crimes were seen as particularly heinous: murderers, highway robbers, and those who had violated the sacred bonds of society. The prolonged nature of the execution served multiple purposes. It allowed time for the condemned to repent, it maximized the deterrent effect on spectators, and perhaps most importantly, it demonstrated the absolute power of the state over the human body. In 1348, during the chaos following the Black Death, authorities in Augsburg used the wheel to execute a gang of brigands who had been terrorizing plague-weakened communities. The chronicler noted that the breaking lasted from the 3rd hour until Vespers, and still 3 of them lived through the night, crying out for water and mercy that would not come. This account reveals the medieval mindset. Suffering wasn't an unfortunate side effect of execution. It was the entire point. The wheel transformed death from a moment into a journey, one that the entire community was forced to witness and remember. The ritual of the wheel began long before the first blow fell. The condemned would be led to the scaffold in a procession that could take hours, stopping at various points for public denouncement of their crimes. Upon reaching the execution ground, they would be stripped and laid out in a spread-eagle position, each limb tied to stakes driven into the ground. The executioner would then make a show of measuring the limbs, marking where each blow would fall, a psychological torture that preceded the physical. The breaking followed a specific pattern that varied by region but always shared the same methodical cruelty. In France, the executioner would deliver precisely measured blows, 2 to each shin, 2 to each thigh, 2 to each forearm, and 2 to each upper arm. The German method was often more elaborate, sometimes including blows to the spine and ribs. Each strike was delivered with a special iron-reinforced section of the wheel's rim, designed to shatter bone while minimizing damage to the skin, keeping the victim alive and conscious. But it was the threading that truly distinguished the wheel from other forms of execution. With bones shattered and limbs now grotesquely flexible, the executioner would weave the victim's body through the spokes. Arms and legs would be bent at impossible angles, creating a human knot of agony. One witness to an execution in Nuremberg in 1581 wrote, "The criminal's face was turned skyward, and in his eyes I saw not just pain, but a terrible awareness of his condition. He spoke still, though his words were lost in his moans." The psychological element was perhaps the cruelest aspect. Victims remained fully conscious, able to speak, to plead, to pray. They could see the crowd below, feel the sun burning their exposed flesh, sense the approach of carrion birds. Some lingered for days in this state, their broken bodies becoming a living reminder of the price of defying authority. The executioner would sometimes be instructed to deliver a blow of mercy, a final strike to the chest or neck to end the suffering. But this mercy was not guaranteed and could be withheld as additional punishment. What made the breaking wheel truly effective wasn't just its physical brutality, it was how it weaponized time itself. While other execution methods delivered death as a sharp, definitive moment, the wheel stretched mortality into an agonizing limbo that could last days. This wasn't an oversight or unintended consequence. It was the entire philosophical foundation of the punishment. Medieval authorities understood something profound about human psychology. The anticipation of death could be more terrifying than death itself. Witnesses reported that crowds would return day after day to observe the slow decline of the condemned, watching as exposure, dehydration, and shock gradually claimed what the wheel had left behind. The dying would call out for water, for mercy, for their mothers. Some would hallucinate, speaking to invisible figures or reciting childhood prayers. Others would fall silent, their eyes tracking the movement of clouds across the sky with an awareness that seemed to transcend their physical agony. This public display served as a masterclass in social control. Parents would bring disobedient children to see the wheel, pointing to the broken figure above and warning, "This is what becomes of those who stray from righteousness." The condemned became unwilling teachers in a lesson about power, order, and the consequences of transgression. Even hardened soldiers and executioners found themselves disturbed by the wheel's particular brand of cruelty. In 1587, an executioner in Cologne reportedly fell ill after performing a wheeling and refused to ever conduct another, claiming he was haunted by the victim's 3-day ordeal. But why did this method eventually disappear? What could cause a society that embraced such spectacular cruelty to suddenly recoil from its own creation? The wheel claimed victims across all levels of society, but certain cases became etched into the historical record through their particular horror or significance. In 1581, the case of Peter Stumpp, the werewolf of Bedburg, demonstrated the wheel at its most theatrical. Accused of lycanthropy, murder, and cannibalism, Stumpp faced not just the wheel, but an elaborate preliminary torture involving the tearing of flesh with red-hot pincers. After being broken on the wheel, his body was burned and his head mounted on a pole topped with a wooden wolf, creating a grotesque tableau that merged execution with folklore. In France, the case of Robert-François Damiens in 1757 marked one of the last great spectacles of the wheel. After attempting to assassinate King Louis XV, Damiens faced a modified version of the punishment that included having molten lead poured into his wounds before the breaking began. The execution lasted over 4 hours, with Damiens remaining conscious almost until the end, reportedly looking at his mangled limbs with a mixture of horror and disbelief. The philosopher Michel Foucault would later use this execution as the opening scene of his work, Discipline and Punish, marking it as a watershed moment in the history of punishment. Different regions developed their own variations of the wheel, each reflecting local concepts of justice and suffering. In the German states, the wheel was often combined with other tortures. Criminals might be branded or have limbs severed before the breaking began. In Eastern Europe, Particularly in territories facing Ottoman expansion, the wheel took on religious overtones, with Christian criminals sometimes being arranged in cruciform positions on the wheel as a perverse mirror of martyrdom. The Swiss developed perhaps the most methodical approach, with detailed manuals specifying exactly how many blows should be delivered to each limb based on the severity of the crime. These cases reveal how the wheel served not just as punishment but as a form of statecraft. Each spectacular execution reinforced the power of the authorities while providing a shared experience that bound communities together in their revulsion and fascination. The wheel created stories that would be retold for generations, each retelling serving as a renewal of the original warning. The wheel's demise began not with a sudden moral awakening but with a gradual shift in how European society understood the relationship between power, punishment, and the human body. The Enlightenment brought new ideas about dignity, reason, and the purpose of justice. Philosophers like Cesare Beccaria argued that the spectacle of extreme punishment actually corrupted public morals rather than reinforcing them. In his influential 1764 work on crimes and punishments, Beccaria wrote that the punishment of death is not useful because of the example of cruelty it gives to men. The French Revolution, despite its own violent excesses, marked a turning point. The guillotine was adopted specifically because it delivered death instantly and equally to all condemned, regardless of social status. This mechanical efficiency stood in stark contrast to the prolonged, personalized agony of the wheel. When the revolutionary government abolished the wheel in 1791, they declared it incompatible with the dignity of a republic founded on the rights of man. Across Europe, the wheel began to disappear from legal codes. Prussia abolished it in 1754 under Frederick the Great, who deemed it unworthy of an enlightened state. Austria followed in 1776 under Maria Theresa. The last recorded use of the wheel in Western Europe occurred in Prussia in 1841. A bungled execution where the condemned survived the initial breaking and had to be strangled by the executioner, causing public outrage that sealed the method's fate. But perhaps the true reason for the wheel's abandonment lay deeper than philosophical arguments or legal reforms. As European society modernized, the public appetite for prolonged spectacles of suffering diminished. The Industrial Revolution created new concepts of efficiency and standardization that made the wheel's elaborate ritual seem archaic. More subtly, the rise of the modern state meant that power no longer needed such dramatic displays to maintain authority. The wheel became a relic of an age when justice and theater were inseparable, when the human body served as a canvas for social messages written in pain. The breaking wheel left scars on the European consciousness that extended far beyond its abolition. Its influence can be traced through language itself. The English phrase, "broken on the wheel," entered common usage as a metaphor for complete physical and spiritual destruction. In German, Aufsradflechten, to braid onto the wheel, became synonymous with the ultimate punishment, a phrase that lingered in legal texts long after the actual practice ended. Modern historians and human rights scholars study the wheel as a crucial chapter in the evolution of concepts of cruel and unusual punishment. Dr. Mitchell Meerbach, in his study of medieval execution practices, argues that the wheel represented the apex of judicial violence as public pedagogy, a teaching tool that used the criminal's body as a text to be read by the community. This perspective helps us understand how societies can normalize extreme cruelty when it serves perceived social needs. The wheel's legacy poses uncomfortable questions about our own era. While we recoil from such Baroque cruelty, modern states still grapple with how to punish while maintaining claims to civilization. The prolonged suffering of life imprisonment, the psychological torture of solitary confinement, the medicalized efficiency of lethal injection, all represent evolved answers to the same questions the wheel once addressed. As historian V.C. Gatrell observed, the wheel may be gone, but the impulse that created it, the desire to inscribe state power onto deviant bodies, merely took new forms. Perhaps most haunting is what the wheel reveals about human adaptability. Entire communities would gather to watch these extended death scenes. Vendors would sell food, children would play nearby. The executioners who operated the wheel were often respected craftsmen, passing their techniques from father to son. This normalization of extreme cruelty serves as a warning. Any society, under the right conditions, can convince itself that the unthinkable is not only acceptable, but necessary. The breaking wheel stands as perhaps the most elaborate form of execution ever devised, transforming death into a days-long performance of state power. But believe it or not, this wasn't the only forgotten horror lurking in medieval Europe's judicial arsenal. Because while the wheel operated in full public view, there was another method, used in the secret chambers beneath castle keeps that made even hardened inquisitors blanch. They called it the Pair of Anguish, and unlike the wheel, it left no visible marks, only screams that echoed through stone corridors and victims who emerged broken in ways no crowd would ever see. If you found this dark chapter of history fascinating, subscribe for more forgotten horrors every week. Hit the notification bell so you never miss these untold stories from the past. History is darker than most people realize, and we're only scratching the surface.